Good morning everybody, welcome to today's webinar on mastering local adjustments. So we're going to look at all things related to local adjustments, the sort of basics of it, and then the practical use of it, dodging and burning, and a few other bits and pieces as well. If this is your first webinar and you don't know who you're listening to, my name's David. I'm part of the software sales team based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. As usual, we've got 60 minutes today. You're very welcome and encouraged to ask questions throughout. If you look at the bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see the last section is called questions. So just put a question in there, that will come straight through to me. If you're on your iOS device or Android device, down the bottom there's a question mark icon, and you can tap that and ask a question in a similar way. Try to keep your questions on today's subject, not really for my benefit but for anyone else watching, so we don't go off tangent too much. There is quite a lot of you as well, so if I don't get to your question, please don't be offended. This is also being recorded and will pop up on YouTube probably sometime tomorrow. You'll also get a follow-up email roughly in 1 hour's time, which will have a link to the playlist, our YouTube channel rather, so you can subscribe and get notifications when it's uploaded. So let us begin and we can get started. So you should be able to see Capture One on screen now. You might see the cursor highlighted like this every now and then, just to help you orientate where we're going. So let's start off with the basics. Now, the important thing to know about local adjustments is that it's all managed within the Local Adjustments tool tab. And just to be doubly sure that you have all of this set up correctly, the best thing to do is to go to the default workspace, and that will preload every tool that's compatible. Let's just go to default workspace. Don't think I've missed anything in there in mine. No, I shall go back to my workspace. Pretty sure everything is there. So that's a good thing to do, especially if you haven't used local adjustments before. Maybe you've messed about with the workspace and you've removed a few things from local adjustments or whatever. So just to do a double check, make sure you've got all of the tools that are compatible with local adjustments. If you don't see a tool here on the default workspace, that's because it doesn't work with local adjustments. So it's pretty much everything, or anything that's applicable to work with a local adjustment is compatible like so. So the top tool, the local adjustments tool, this is where you manage your various local adjustments. And if you're used to working with Photoshop, then it's basically a layer-like system where you define layers, you create a mask, and then you have different adjustments for each of those layers. So it's much more Photoshop-like. If any of you are on Lightroom or have used Lightroom in the past, then you're going to be more used to creating brushes, I guess is the best way to put it. So it's different in Capture One in that respect, that you create a layer and then you have an adjustment on that layer. Lightroom, just for the comparison, is more like creating a brush. So I'd say Capture One is a bit more Photoshop-like. So with that in mind, let's just clear the mess I've done there and then talk about the basic way to start creating local adjustments. So as I briefly said, local adjustments are created by drawing a mask, and then whatever mask you draw, the adjustment is then on that mask. And we can draw a mask in a few different ways. So if you look at the icon down here, we can draw a mask with a brush, we can erase our mask, we've got a gradient mask as well, and of course the way we build up those masks varies too. There's actually a couple of other ways to create the mask too. So first of all, let's just grab our brush, or you can press B on the keyboard. That's what this indicates here. So B for brush, and then that gives us this different icon. We've got brush settings here. That's this icon, or probably easier, we can right click to get our various different brush parameters up like so. So let's just go for full hardness, opacity of flow, and let's just draw a mask on the top. And then we can press M to show and hide the mask. Now how your mask looks, just so you know, if we go to preferences, we can actually change the mask color if we wish. So if we stick it on defaults, it comes out as a red mask, as you can see, like so. But if you want to change the color of the mask, you can just go in here and change it to anything that you like. Let's just get rid of those. So if you don't like the red, then you can just change that. So full hardness, opacity and flow, that's the kind of mask we end up with. Let's just drop the hardness down. We end up with 2 concentric circles, and that basically means that the mask will bleed or feather from the center circle to the outer circle. So if we just draw another line like so, you can see it's now nice and feathered. Let's right click once more and change opacity. That basically changes the effectiveness of the underlying adjustment. So if we draw this mask, then you can see it's fainter. It's now at 50%. So if I press M on my keyboard, again, you can see the shortcut here, hide and display mask with M. If we just hide the mask and I just pull something like exposure, you can see the different effect. So full hardness, feathering, and then lower opacity has basically 50% of the effect of whatever adjustment that we've put on there. Now if we press M to show the mask again and right click once more, we've got something called flow, which we're going to use kind of in context a bit later, and that's great for dodging and burning, or selective lightening and selective darkening, because that helps us build up the mask in a slow and controlled way. So at 100, whenever we make a pass with the brush, we're going to go to whatever we've set as our maximum opacity, in this case 50%, immediately. So one brush, we're going to hit opacity straight away. If we turn the flow down, then we're going to build up our mask as the brush moves. So flow is a movement-based control. So now if I go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, gradually the mask will build up until we reach our max opacity. So if we turn this up to 100 and then go back and forth, then you see gradually my mask builds up like so. So that's a really useful control, one that you should get used to because it's great for dodging and burning, so selective lightening and darkening. Finally, or almost finally, we've got Airbrush. So this is a time-based control. So if we turn Airbrush on and then I press, it's like spraying an airbrush, of course. So in this case, the lower the flow, the longer it will take to build up. So if we turn flow up and then I click and hold again, then you can say it builds up faster. I personally don't have much use for Airbrush, so I very rarely have that on, but flow and opacity, really, really useful. If you're on a Wacom, and I would strongly suggest that if you get heavily into local adjustments, it's way easier doing this with a pen and tablet as opposed to a mouse, just purely for comfort and the ease of drawing more complex masks. Pen pressure basically correlates to size. So if I do a light press on my tablet, you see I get a small mask. If I press hard, then I get a big mask. Like so. But pen pressure is only related to size. Again, it's not something I use a great deal myself, but it's there if you want it. Auto mask, we can find edges, and I'll show you that a bit later as well. Not something I use a huge amount, but good to know it's there. So, shortcut wise, you saw that we had some basic stuff for draw mask, erase mask. So if I press E, then we get erase mask up, so we can erase, B for brush, and so on. There's a few other options that you're going to need to keep an eye on later. So we've got the ability to invert mask, fill mask, copy masks, and so on. So that's up in the subcontext menu. Also, we can add layers by clicking plus, and of course remove layers by clicking minus, and we can turn the effect of the layer on and off by clicking the tick next to the layer itself. So now we've made a complete mess of that. Let's get rid of that layer and then look at gradient mask as well. So that's a different way of drawing a mask. Still totally editable, but a different way of drawing a mask, which is great for all kinds of things, traditionally used in landscapes, of course, for balancing up exposure, but there's a bunch of other uses for it as well. So if you choose your gradient mask, then you get a cross icon up on screen, as you can see. Where you start drawing, your mask will be the strongest, and where you finish drawing, your mask will be at 0, so faded to 0. If you hold Shift key down, then it keeps it vertical, horizontal, or 45 degrees. So Shift to lock it to that inclination. So if we do a long draw like that, and you can see the mask, if I press M to turn the mask on and off, we get a nice shallow fade out, which is great for sort of balancing up exposure and things. If we drew a very short mask, then you see it's going to have a much harder edge, like so. So long pull, nice soft bleed off, short pull, then we end up with a very hard edge, like so, as you can see. So gradient mask, just so you're aware how it works, and we use those a couple of ways as we go. Any recommendations for Wacom? Edwin says, yes. You don't have to spend a whole bunch of money. Obviously you can if you want to, but even their lower priced products are great, to be honest. So the difference between, if you like, the more professional line and the more basic line is levels of pressure sensitivity. But if that's something you're not going to use, then really there's kind of less benefit, and they have more sort of customizable keys and so on. But really, you don't have to spend a bunch of money to get an enormous benefit from using one. Oh, good point from Greg, actually. When I get a gradient mask, I get an orange dot on screen that lets you drag it around. How do I turn it off? So let's draw Greg's gradient, and then down under here we've got show selection points. So that basically tells me where I first started doing that. Then if I want to, I can then move that mask around if you wish, like so. So that's under here, show selection points. Not something I ever use myself, but it's kind of handy to know it's there. So let's delete that. And does the gradient mask always go to the edge? Well, no, it depends where you stop. So if I start and stop here, then the gradient mask actually stops there, but it does start at that edge as such. I mean, if we do one down there, like so, if we start and draw upwards, then it starts at the bottom and goes up. It always bleeds to this edge. But of course, you can move it. So if I actually just hold my command key down, we can sort of move the gradient around as I wish, and there's nothing to stop you editing that with an erase brush as well. So it is possible to edit that gradient as much as you like. Okay, that's enough on the sort of basics. So you know how to draw a mask, you know how to erase a mask, you know how to do a gradient mask, and you know if you right click you can get all the various different brush settings by right clicking or control clicking. Oh, the last checkbox here, link brush and eraser, just means you have the same values here when you switch between brush and eraser. But you can have independent eraser options if you wish. So let's look at some actual examples and how we use this tool. Always good to see it in context. So something dead basic. Of course, before you start messing around with local adjustments, you should obviously get some basic corrections in first. So don't just fly straight into local adjustments. You want an image which has a decent white balance, good exposure and so on. And then you can break the image down into various different elements and think, how could I use it? Now remember, you've got all these various different tools at your disposal, which you can use singly or in combination of each other as well. So let's make a new layer. And let's just call this, I'm just calling this dirt at the front, like so. So we've got this kind of skid mark or whatever it is, but it'd be nice if we could enhance that a little bit. Now the trick with local adjustments is often not to be too precise. So if you start being super precise, then it looks really obvious that you've done something on the image. So the softer you can be, excuse me, and perhaps more random you can be, the better. So for example, let's grab a brush. I've got full opacity and flow. We won't get into anything complex so far. M to show and hide the mask, if you wish. Seth was saying my mask disappears when I draw. That's probably because you've got only display mask when drawing switched on, and then it does tend to do that. If you don't have that switched on, then check that you're on Capture One 10.02, because there was a bug, I think, with some graphics cards that could cause that to happen. Now notice, if I want to, I could just fill in this hole in the middle, or we can actually say fill mask, and then that will fill in the middle like so. So that's just a good shortcut. So that's a really rough looking wobbly mask just over the dirt at the front. But if I grab something like clarity, for example, then we can just easily help to enhance that, and you'd never know I'd drawn a mask there, even though it's pretty rough. The only sort of hint we might see it is over here, but if I press E for erase, then we could just take out anything that you feel might be a bit too obvious. If we turn this on and off, then you see just has a nice additional boost of contrast to that stuff in the front. Now there's nothing to stop you layering up more, so if we add another layer, let's just call this front grad, for example. Grab gradient mask. I would use a shortcut, but it's hard for you to follow shortcuts, so that's the reason why I'm not using them. And let's hold the shift key down, start about here and finish there. So that gives me just a mask in the foreground, and I can just add a little bit of structure, which just helps to make it a bit sharper. Probably hard for you to see on a webinar. Let's just zoom in a touch. So front grad, just adding a bit of structure just to add an overall bit of sharpness like so. No point really having structure over the whole image because there's no detail up in the sky, so that doesn't really make any sense. So let's add another layer, and we can go up to 16 if we wish. And let's do something with the sky. So if I start at the top, and actually maybe not, let's just do that. With a gradient, if you redraw the gradient, then you cancel out the previous one. So that's important to know. So if I draw a gradient and decide, you know what, that's not quite right, I want to do this, then it will cancel the previous one. So if I have a gradient like this, and I don't know whether I want to lighten the sky or darken it, depends. Do we want moody or do we want high key? Let's see. Something like that maybe. So that was really quick and dirty, but you see we didn't have to be super precise to get some nice changes. If we option click, so alt click our reset button in the local adjustments tool, that's so before local adjustments and then after, like so. So just a couple of basic changes like so. Little useful thing to point out for working at speed is this curious little icon, brush icon, that lives next to each of the tools in the local adjustments tool tab if you're using the default workspace. So what this little paintbrush means adjust the currently selected layer, which is obvious really. So if I went to dirt and changed exposure, then you would expect that to change, correct. If I went to front grad and changed exposure, you would expect that to change, correct. So basically this little icon means whatever layer I'm on, then adjust the selected layer. And you can see as I buzz up and down the layers, the tools change. Again, a sort of important difference to Lightroom. Excuse me. Now the useful thing is, let's say I'm on front grad, but let's say I go to my exposure tool tab and think, you know what, I could just generally do with lifting the exposure over the whole image. So let's do that, and that actually happens on the whole image, not front grad. Because if we don't have the little icon here, which means adjust selected layer, it will be on the background. So that's really good to know that in the local adjustments tool tab, if you're on the default workspace, the tools work on the selected layer. If you are not in the local adjustments tool tab, then the tools work on the background. So that will give me an overall adjustment like so. So really good tip to know. And it also means that some people get tripped up. Let's say they've messed around with a workspace and then say, okay, I'm just going to add back my white balance tool, for example, here it is, you may find that it doesn't have the little paintbrush icon here, which means this one is going to work off the background. So if you want it to work on the selected layer, you have to say adjust selected layer, like so, and then you get the little paintbrush icon. So if ever weird stuff is going on where the adjustments you make doesn't happen on the layer, then you don't have the adjust selected layer option on. Okay. Seth is saying, even with always display mask, my mask disappears while drawing. So I'm on integrated graphics on an i5. Yeah, I'd say it's probably a graphics card issue. So what you could do in preferences under general is just turn display hardware acceleration off. So if you set that to never, then I'm sure that will fix the issue. Probably the integrated graphics card isn't beefy enough to work with local adjustments. No, Dominic, they're not alpha channels, so you can't bring them into Photoshop. So we're working on the raw data, so sadly not, you can't bring them into Photoshop. Okay, let's look at something else. So kind of different use of gradient mask. Let's go to the unadjusted one. Something like this, backlit, exposure not quite right. So we could grab our gradient mask, just draw in from the right hand side, probably about there, and then just lift up exposure a touch. So gradients aren't only for landscape photographers, they're just good for really evening out exposure and doing all kinds of various tricks like that. You know, or even if you want to add flair, for example, if we just throw in a gradient like that and then bump up exposure, then we can just play around with lighting in a very sort of basic sense as well. Yes, Ron, we go through healing and cloning, don't worry. So we've looked at some clarity and exposure stuff. I mean, that's just a really basic, simple example that can just help play around with exposure easily. And remember, you're working on the raw file, so it's totally non-destructible. Non-destructive, not non-destructible, totally non-destructive. You're not getting a large file size like you would be in Photoshop and so on. So a different approach about local adjustments is also with regards to sharpening, for example. Excuse me. So on an image like this, let's just zoom in to 100%. We've got our subject in focus here, but then very quickly we bleed off shallow depth of field, as is common in food photography. So there really isn't any benefit to sharpening out of focus areas. We might as well target our our sharpening on the sharp areas. And that's really easy to do. And we can create ourselves a sharpening brush, if you like. So on my background layer, let's look at sharpening and let's just put that to 0. So basically I've got no sharpening on the image itself at all. So now I think, well, let's just selectively sharpen the areas that I want to. So let's make a new layer and call this sharpen. Sharpen, like so. Now, right now, of course, if I zoom in, whoops, come on, David. If I zoom in and start playing with sharpening, nothing happens because we haven't drawn a mask. So you could do one of two things. We could first of all draw a mask. So we could think, well, actually, where are we going to sharpen? So we're going to sharpen what's in focus. So it's probably going to be here. So we could just draw our mask in like so. Blah, blah, blah. And then 100%, of course. And now we can grab our sharpening slider and then we can sharpen exactly how we want to, which is just on that layer. So if we turn that layer on and off, then we can do so. Very nice. We've just sharpened the areas that we wanted to. We haven't sharpen the out of focus areas, which, you know, there's really no point. So now we've done sharpening there, we could think, well, actually, is our pepper pot benefit from sharpening? Maybe. So then we could just brush over like that as well. And you could do the same with noise reduction. So if you wanted to just brush on noise reduction, like if you needed to have a bit more noise reduction on the shadows or something else, then that's something else you could do locally too. Now a different approach, which is often favored by Photoshop or experienced Photoshop people, I said, because the way Photoshop works, of course, if you're a heavy Photoshop user, you know that you do nothing on the background. You do everything on layers. And when you're making adjustment layers, I think by default, I'm rusty on my Photoshop, that basically when you make a new adjustment layer, you see the adjustment over the whole image first of all. So let's do this again. Let's say make a new layer and we call this sharpen, like so. And remember, if I zoom in and I adjust my sharpening, I can't see anything happening because there is no mask present. So if I do a trick and say invert mask, then basically this gives me a mask over the whole image, a bit like an adjustment layer in Photoshop. So now I can adjust my sharpening and think, okay, how much do I want to have? Like so. Think, okay, that looks good. So now I'm going to invert my mask, like so, and now I can grab a brush and then just brush in that sharpening value wherever I feel it sees fit, like so. So that's just another, whoops, another approach. Let's go back up to the pepper pot and then just throw in a bit of sharpening there. Probably doesn't need it here because it's just falling out of focus. So that little invert mask trick is quite handy and can be useful for all kinds of things. So let's just say we wanted to lift the exposure in some areas. Excuse me. Let's say we wanted to lift exposure in some areas. I could make a new layer and just call this brighten or lighten or whatever you want to call it. Now if I start putting exposure, of course nothing happens because there is no mask. But if I say invert mask and think, well, this area I want to be a bit brighter, how bright do I want it to be? Maybe like that. Now I can invert the mask back in again, and then I can take my brush, probably nice and big and soft, and then just brush in that lightening effect where I need it to be as such. So different kind of approach, both works, neither is right or wrong as such. Okay, good question from Seth. Will the sharpening here and local adjustments interact with recipe proofing? Yes, so if we go to 100%, if you don't know what recipe proofing is, it's worth researching, so I'll just do it very quickly. Let's say Seth is going to export this to a JPEG at 2000 pixels wide. If we turn on recipe proofing, then straight away Capture One will proof that output down to 2000 pixels, and if we want to, we can add more output sharpening if we wish. But yes, everything that you see proofed here takes into account local adjustments, including the sharpening as well. So a little bit on sharpening there. How are we doing for time? Half an hour. Okay, so if we just scroll down a bit, let's have a look at probably the next section. So we've seen a little bit of it about dodging and burning as such. So selective darkening and selective lightening. Oh, actually I forgot one thing. Before we do that, I just did forget one thing. Let's turn proofing off and fit to screen. Just going to mute myself for 1 second while I sneeze. Bear with me. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. I think nobody wanted their eardrums burst by me, I think. No, Gary, you don't have proofing in Capture One 9, so you've got to go to 10 for that. So one thing I forgot to show you with just basic mask drawing, if you have a, what's the word, polygonal object, like square or something with straight lines, and you want to draw straight lines, let's make a new layer. Let's call that Shed 2. Grab a brush. Let's right click and do something a bit harder, probably smaller too. And then if we start masking in one corner, let's just see M to see my mask. If we hold Shift key down, then we get a straight line between my points. So you can draw around objects that are square or triangles or whatever very easily. So that's just shift click between mask drawing points like so, and then you can draw straight lines. Same as Photoshop, if you know that from there. So yeah, I just forgot to mention that. Okay, so going back to selective sort of lightening and darkening, let's go to a wedding. Why not? And I will just reset the local adjustments. So sometimes, obviously, if you're an old person like me, you can remember working in the darkroom and varying exposure time on the enlarger when you were printing onto paper, of course. And we cut holes in pieces of card, make shapes with your hands, or block the light in various areas to change the exposure on the print itself. It's way easier to do it in the digital darkroom as such, and of course much more consistent. So there's a few different methods that you can do. Pick and choose which you prefer, but this is where the very important slider of flow comes into play. So let's make a new layer and let's call this darken, because we've got a few hotspots here which are kind of distracting. So let's call that darken like so. Whoops. Try that again, darken. Now we can do a few different methods. We can drop the exposure. For example, we can use a curve, and I would suggest Luma curve because that keeps color constant. So if we wanted to just drop exposure, again, we could use our inverse mask technique. So if we say invert mask, remember that gives us a mask over the whole image. And we're looking at these areas and think, you know what, I just want to darken them down a bit. So how much do I need? So maybe I need something like that, and maybe additionally a bit of highlight recovery as well, like so. So that gives me a good possible result on those areas. So a combination of highlight recovery and a little Luma curve tweak like so. But that darkens the whole image, which is not a good thing. So let's invert that mask, and now we can brush that back in where we see fit. Now, if we grab our brush and probably make it nice and soft, full flow and opacity, if I start brushing, looks really obvious, doesn't it? Because we've gone straight to 100% in one fell swoop, which is not what we want to do. So if I do Command Z to undo, so undo, and then this time let's drop our flow right down, and probably the opacity bit as well, just to soften the effects. A nice low flow, nice big soft brush, and now I can just brush in that sort of adjustment to something where I think is about right. And of course, if I brush more in one area, then it's going to have a heavier effect because the flow is going to build up, remember, to my master opacity. So if we look at the mask, if I press M to see my mask, it's kind of hard to see actually. Let's do preferences, appearance. Let's change my mask color to something super lurid, like so. So let's do M for mask. So now, there you go. So you can see, look, the way the mask is built up, it's stronger here, less strong here, and so on because of that all important flow. So let's turn darken on and off. So it's just killed those kind of hot areas in the center of the image. And if I need to do a bit more, I can just brush like so. So really sort of super simple, and that's a combination of, remember, the curve and high dynamic range. So now I want to lighten. I can't see the shot, my selfie stick shot of the group. So we make another layer, and let's call this lighten. I always use the term lighten and darken because I always get confused about what dodge and burn means with relation to a digital file, which is not printing a negative and so on. So lighten and darken is really easy to remember, at least for me. So if I say invert mask again, remember that gives us a mask over the whole image, like so. And then raise up my Luma curve, and then I'm sort of looking at this area to think what's going to be a good result. Maybe, excuse me, a bit more clarity as well. Maybe some shadow recovery as well, actually, just to lift that a bit. So that's again going to be good for this spot. So let's invert my mask once more. take my brush, that's way too big, so we need to make that smaller. Let's just zoom in a bit. Probably smaller still. Nice low flow again, so I can just build it up gradually. If we need it to happen a bit faster, we can lift the flow. Like so. So if we turn that lighten layer on and off, then we can see the effect. And of course, if I need to adjust what it's doing, like if we want that even brighter, you know, we can just raise and lower that curve, or we could use exposure if we wanted to as well. Your choice, basically. So that was that lighten adjustment. Now there's nothing to stop me using that elsewhere if I want to. So if we want to lighten anything, like just this lady's hair in the front, dress at the bottom, then it's pretty simple to do so. We can go back to the darken layer again if I want to darken that down a bit more, and so on. So very super simple, super simple. Option click to see before and after, before and after. So just balancing of those tones. Really basic stuff, but can make a huge difference to the image, and of course saves you having to do that step in Photoshop, and you've got all that raw data to work with as well too. Okay, let's have a look at another dodge and burn. Whoops, another dodge and burn as such. Let's go to this nice shot in Mongolia, I think it is, not my image, one of Drew's. Now you can see there's all kinds of stuff going on with local adjustments. I probably won't do all of these, but again, just to give you an idea of what's possible, let's reset that. So first of all, we can break this down into the different elements. So we've got the foreground, we've got the vehicle, we've got the sky, and so on. So let's do a basic one. Grab a gradient mask. Who was asking? That was just the angle of the gradient. Gary was asking. So basically wherever you draw it, Gary. So shift key will keep it vertical, or you can just move your cursor / pen around. So let's go something like that. So that's my gradient mask. So I can drop exposure down. Don't be afraid to really pull around the raw file. And if you're not sure how much data you have, if you look at just on the background layer and just pull the sliders around, then that will give you a good idea of how much versatility there is in the raw file, which may well surprise you. So let's drop exposure down. Let's have some clarity, maybe some more saturation, as we've got some nice colors in there too. Yeah, why not? And then if we want to, we can pick a color within that mask, and we're going to get onto this. So let's pull out the color in that sky layer, and then we could saturate. Ooh, maybe too much. Maybe too much. So we could try and darken it down just a touch as well. We could pull out the warm tone in the sky, play around with that a bit too. Let's have more saturation and so on. So we've done quite a hefty tweak to the sky there. So let's name that layer. Always good idea to name your layer so you know what the heck each one is doing. Let's have foreground. Let's do a gradient. Do we do a gradient? Yeah, let's do a gradient. Probably something like that, which gives us pretty much all of the gradient, because I think it's looking a bit muddy. So let's just lift it a bit. If you need to redraw it, then we can do so. So let's lift that, not too much so it's obvious. Again, let's have some clarity, and it's probably super sharp as Drew, my colleague, took this. So loads of nice detail there. So what we could do is have a bit of structure as well, which helps to define those edges. No real point doing structure on the sky because that's kind of getting out of focus. So that would just pull out noise if anything. So that's bumped up our foreground nicely. Let's make another layer, call this rainy clouds. Take a brush this time, and probably nice and soft, and let's just grab probably along there. Again, you see I'm not getting too pedantic about being super accurate with the brush, and then a bit more clarity, and just lift or drop it down with the curve a bit like so, just to darken that off. If we need to adjust that, then we can just fill in a bit more if we need to. So that just makes our clouds in the background a little bit more moody, just a little bit. And then last of all, because of the stuff we've done has kind of made our vehicle look a bit dull, let's make another layer and call this Truck Lighten. Do the same as we did before. If you want, we can say Invert Mask, and then let's just grab our Luma curve. It's going to lift it up like that. Let's invert back, take our brush, nice low flow again, so that we can just gradually lighten this if we need to. So it builds it up in a nice slow and controlled way. Let's see what that did. So that just lightens that nicely. It's gone a bit over there, so if I press E for erase, then we can just clean that up like so. Like so. So just a little bit of sort of light modeling on the truck if we want to. So if we option click our reset button, so that's before local adjustments and then after local adjustments. Quite a big difference, as you can see. Maybe that sky was a bit too over the top. So you can always go back and play afterwards, of course. So before and after. And again, not a huge amount of time spent, but you know, don't underestimate how much raw data there is in your file. I mean, this is from a Phase 1 IQ 100, which has tons of leeway, of course. But most modern cameras these days, of course, have pretty impressive dynamic range. So don't be afraid. See what the limitations are of your files. And local adjustments are a good way to explore that. Good question from Jonathan. Obviously a Photoshop user. Can we group the adjustment layers? No, you can't. They're basically just presented as their list of max 16 layers as such. So no, might be nice, but no, you can't as such. Can we readjust after drawing it? Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. And you saw that, Gary, I think. So any of these layers, as you saw with the sky, if I thought, you know what, I've gone way too over the top there, we can just tweak and adjust as much as we like. Okay, good timing, Dominic, for your question. Create local adjustment layer from the color editor. Yeah, which is a great feature. So let's switch collections. Shall we use this one? Let's use this one, because a couple of people, and we'll use the shed again as well. So, I mean, you've seen throughout the past 45 minutes or whatever that none of the masks I've drawn have been particularly accurate. I think if you get into that drawing or worrying about being super accurate with masks all the time, it looks too obvious what you're doing. So if you keep everything soft, if you have low flow to build up gradually, then it also looks better. But let's say in this case we want to just treat the grass bank in front. Now we could, of course, you could draw a mask like so. Let's just press M to see our mask. So we could try and draw a mask along the front if we wanted to, and so on. But we've pretty much got the same color, roughly the same color tone on the front. And in this case, we might want to treat the sky separately, and we might want to get as close as we can to around all those different elements. But you could auto mask your way around it, but it's pretty fiddly and sort of time consuming and so on. So why not use the power of the color editor? So in our advanced tab on the color editor, grab our color picker, and then let's just pick somewhere on the grass. that will give us a suggestion of the color range. Now remember, that's only a suggestion. So if we turn on view selected color range, we can see exactly what color range we've selected, because that dips anything to monochrome which is not part of the selection. Now I'm going to just expand this out because we've got a little bit missing down the front, just to make sure we're covering as much of this area as possible, but without encroaching into the sky, which will be kind of around there somewhere. So we can be pretty sort of haphazard with that. So if we turn off view selected color range and just grab lightness, you can see we've got pretty much our selection at the front like so. So what we can do now in the sub menu of the color editor is say create mask layer from selection. So the color selection will be transformed into a mask. So if we say that, takes a couple of seconds, and that's the mask that has been created based on our color selection. So now in my local adjustments, we've got all the possibility to work with those tools. So let's say we just want a bit more contrast in the front, then we can just do a nice curve, add some contrast without affecting anything else. Now as we've got the foreground, excuse me, we can easily flip this or invert it as such and use this for the sky. So if we make a new layer and we call this sky, then if you remember, we had in here, oh bugger, pressed reset, so undo. We had in here, we had copy mask. So we can do an exact copy of my layer 1. So let's say copy mask from layer 1, which gives me this again. And then we can say invert mask, which will give me this. So we've got a few bits and pieces at the front, but it's probably not going to really matter too much. So if I wanted to desaturate the sky, for example, then we could do so quite nicely. And on this layer, if we want to just lighten that or darken, let's go light, then we can do so. So for creating masks around complex objects, the color editor is really handy to be able to do that. So if we just grab another example just really quickly, this is totally unadjusted I think, so let's just pull out the sky and say create mask layer from selection, etc, etc, then whoops, then we get mask that looks like this. So that will give me the ability to just darken down the blue sky. We can make it more contrasty and so on and so forth, like so. And probably, I don't know if this is going to work, if I make a new layer, call that castle, and say copy mask from layer 1, what does that give us? Oh, now I need to say invert. It's probably going to be a bit of a weird mask. Actually not bad, not bad. We could always erase out the clouds. It's kind of pulled in that cloud as well. But if we just raise the exposure, you know, really, as opposed to kind of trying to auto mask your way around that, then we can use that method to pull it out as well. If you do want to auto mask, just so you know how it works, as someone was asking earlier, let's say you just want to mask around this edge, and it's contrast detection basically. So if we grab a brush, make this smaller and turn on auto mask, basically the little circle that's now appeared in the center is your sample zone. So let's just make sure I'm drawing a mask. Oh, we want full opacity and flow, like so. So basically when I'm drawing, if my sample zone becomes different to the outer circle edge, the outer brush edge, then it will find an edge. But it will only happen when you release the mouse or pen, like so. So brush, 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 let go, then it finds the edge. So we can happily mask along, probably easier with a bigger brush actually. Like so. So quite happily finds that edge, as you can see. So that's how you auto mask. I'd say personally it's not something I use a huge amount because then I think it looks really obvious that you've done some local adjustment masking. So I find softer brushes, gradient masks using the color editor gives you actually a much more realistic look as such. Could you make the grass purple? Ron says, if you wanted to. But might be a bit laborious. So within our grass layer, if we go to the color editor, then we can pick within that mask as such, and then basically you would just change the hue rotation. But as we have a limit to how much hue rotation there is, what you would have to do is just do a few repeated picks, and then we could gradually change the grass to whatever sort of funky color that you wanted, for example. So it is possible, you just might have to pick the same color a few times to get that response. Okay, next, it's not over yet, people. How are we doing for time? Perfect. We've got color editor, color edits with a mask, which is kind of super simple, or actually really powerful. So let's take this scenario. We think I'm going to use my color editor. I'm going to just play around with the color of this paint pot in the front. So I grab my picker, I choose my color, I say view selected color range. I've also got this one and this one. Let's try and squeeze this down as much as possible. But whatever I do with my color range, of course, I'm still going to include some of those other color tones. So what we can do is a really rough mask. So let's grab a brush. Don't need auto mask. Let's make it a bit bigger. M so I can see my mask. I'm just going to do rough mask like this. Really quick and dirty. And now I grab my color editor and pick within that. And then now if I just grab sort of lightness, you can see I'm only affecting my picked color within that mask. So really handy, and again, no need to be accurate with the mask. So here, for example, if we wanted to just change the red on the chilies, if I pick my red, for example, and then try and adjust it, then it's going to affect the whole image. Nothing I can do about that with adjusting the color range. So if I grab my brush and do a rough mask over here, yaddy 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 yaddy, something like that, and then go to the color editor and picked the red within that mask, now I'm free to edit like so without affecting any other colors. So if you run out of options in the color editor by adjusting the range to skinny that down as much as possible, then it's very simple just to make a quick rough mask and do so. Same over here as well. If we picked the flower, I think that probably affects, oh no, she's pretty individual. Pick our prawny friends and change the density, then of course we're actually affecting some of the flowers as well. So if we grab our brush, probably did something really kind of rough like this. You might spend a bit more time. Whoops, wrong shortcut. Go away, grids and guides. Let's say fill mask. Missed a bit. And then pick within our mask, prawn tone, whatever that is, and I can just lighten those guys up without affecting the flowers, for example. Or we could add, you know, more contrast or whatever. We could throw in a curve and so on, like so. So color editor pick inside a mask is really, really powerful. Okay. Oh, poor Natalie has no sound. Yeah, if you missed anything or had a connection issue or whatever, don't forget you can always watch the recording. So the link for that comes in a follow-up email, which you'll get in an hour or so, or something. Is there something like clone stamping? Yes, good timing, because that's our last final thing to look at. Oh, incidentally, as I just accidentally moved that, for any of you that does interior work with mixed lighting, local white balance, really powerful if you're dealing with mixed light sources. So local white balance, we haven't looked at anything with that, but don't forget it's there. So the last thing is basic sort of clone stamp, etc, etc. Now, it's not a Photoshop replacement. I think that's really important to point out. But for removing the sort of odd object or a hair on an image or anything like that, which doesn't require tons of complex Photoshop stuff, but just to remove a basic object, then this is a good place to start. So in this case, what we do is plus, but we click and hold and we say new clone or heal layer. Clone will just copy one part of the image from somewhere to the other. Heal will match the luminosity at the destination to give you a better result. So let's say new heal layer, and we call that boat. And let's take a brush, too big, so let's make that smaller. Note the icon looks a bit different with those pointed arrows around the outside. And like Photoshop, if we option click, we can pick our source. So I want to just pick the horizon, and now we're just going to basically copy the source to the destination. You can have obviously a smaller mask, larger mask, and all that kind of stuff. So let's brush over there, and then that just fixes that quite nicely. Now if we press M, you can see the mask, and you can see we're going from here to here. Pretty self-explanatory. If you want to, you can pick these up and modify the source point, like so, or you can pick up the destination, and then we can move that as well, so you can comfortably jog this around until you get the right result. Now there's only one source point per layer, so this is the limitation. So if you wanted to fix something over here or whatever, then you probably need another source point. So the source point is fixed per layer. So to give you another example, I've probably already fixed it. Let's get rid of this one. So something like just this ugly spot down here. We can say click and hold. Let's make a new heal layer. Spot, like so. Grab a brush. Option click to find the source, and then just brush, 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 and fix quite nicely. So basic stuff like that is really good. And the nice thing about doing it here, of course, if then retrospectively you think, oh, I would just want to change the exposure of this shot, if we lift the exposure, then it, you know, your heal point is going to be fixed accordingly as well. So it doesn't matter at what point you do it, then changes like that, the healing is always going to match quite nicely too. Okay, let's see, can we use high dynamic range? Yeah, of course you can. Yep. So you can use high dynamic range, you can use curves. You can't use levels, not much point really. You might as well use curves as such. So these are the tools that you can use. So in the default workspace, the tools loaded here are the ones that you can use. Gary, if you're migrating from Lightroom, I would recommend looking at our blog. I'll point you towards some resources in just a minute about migration, because there's lots of good tips and so on. Okay, maximum number of local adjustment layers on version 9. I think it's 16 as well, so it's 16 on 10.2. Last thing I want to mention, which is vaguely related, is you saw the various things like invert mask, fill mask, copy mask, and so on, adding new layers, adding clone layers, adding heal layers, changing the brush from brush to eraser to gradient. All of that can be shortcut driven. As I said at the start, I don't tend to use shortcuts in a demo like this because it's hard for you to follow. But if you go to your edit keyboard shortcuts and look down at the bottom to other, then you'll find a whole section with local adjustments where you can make shortcuts for adding layers, clone layers, brush size changes on shortcuts, opacity as well, invert, fill, selecting layers up and down, and so on. So we can use you know, these two shortcuts to move between layers and inverting and filling and so on. So all of this stuff happens much quicker if you drive it with shortcuts, if you can as well. Okay, yes, you can adjust the gradient after drawing it, Gary. It's just basically redraw as you saw before. Okay, just to point you to, while we're on that subject, to point you towards some resources. So if you look at the Capture One blog, especially for those of you who are on Lightroom, if we scroll back, there's a good one here, switching to Capture One Pro. That's a really good article about coming from Lightroom. If we go to page 2, then we've also got, I think maybe it's page 3. Probably if we type in, let's do it the intelligent way. If we type in Lightroom at the top, then we've got various different Lightroom guides as well. So a lot of people have found that really helpful, Gary in particular, about the things that they came across and so on. Okay, next week, as we're pretty much out of time, we're going to be shooting tethered. So if you haven't tried shooting tethered to Capture One, you should, if it's applicable to your work, because it's the fastest solution out there for tethering. If you're trying to tether to Lightroom, for example, you'll find this at least twice as fast, if not 3 times as fast. Full camera control, as you can see on screen, compatibility with Canon, Nikon, Sony and Phase 1 cameras, of course. So I do a basic setup and talk you through the workflow of shooting tethered and getting the most reliable connection as well. So as I said, don't forget this was recorded. So if you did have any connection issues or you want to watch stuff again, then look out for the follow-up email, which you'll get shortly, which will give you a link to our YouTube channel. So please subscribe, then you get notifications of when stuff is uploaded. But the recording probably won't be there until tomorrow, just so you know. Okay. Many thanks for your time, and that did bring us up quite nicely to 60 minutes. So hopefully that was useful to you, and hope to see you all again next week. Take care.